Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Kelly, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Operations. And I know I usually start every show by welcoming a specific member, but today, which is our last show of 2025, I just want to say thank you to all of you who tune in every week and for your membership. So um, thanks for tuning in, and we appreciate you, and we will be back here in 2026. All right, so Brian, the state's unemployment numbers came out for September, and it looks like a streak may have been broken. Tell us more.
Yeah, this is a you might recall as I cover this every month that the state had kind of gradually been going up, 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 up. Not no single month where it was up a lot, but just kind of over time the trend was moving up, and it actually went down. Now again, just by a tenth, so 5.1%. Now, this is the September number. It would normally have been out in October, but with all the data delays with the federal government shutdown, there's some interplay there with state-specific numbers, and so the numbers coming out later than what we would have seen otherwise. But now remember that unemployment can go up and down for good and bad reasons, and so in this case, unfortunately, it's not hiring as much as workforce participation, but nevertheless, we had seen kind of an uncomfortably long trend of it either staying the same or going up. And so maybe just a little bit of relief. Maybe it's a new trend, although there's no reason to believe that there's any sort of new trend, just maybe um, a step along the way. I think if you look at the projections from the RSQE reports the state bases their revenue projections on, don't really expect any sort of dramatic changes over the course of the next year on unemployment.
So Brian, how does Michigan stack up to the federal unemployment rate?
Now, the federal unemployment rate actually it's been lower, and historically it's been lower than Michigan most of my lifetime. And the federal rate is still lower at 4.4%, but actually it did that one did actually increase in September from 4.1 to 4.4. So the federal rate is up a bit, the state rate is down, and so that means there's 0.7% difference, 0.7% difference between the federal and the state rate in the month of September. And we probably will get the October numbers before too long. Um, but I don't have a projection on exactly when that comes out. But again, we're definitely late on this data.
All right, let's talk about interest rates. The Federal Reserve did, as you expected, Brian, with interest rates. So, what does this tell you about their thoughts on the future of inflation and the jobs market?
Well, with the rate was cut a quarter point, and so this is the rate that especially short-term borrowings are based on. So if you have a line of credit that's tied to prime, for example, the it all starts with that Fed funds rate, which is the rate at which banks borrow money, and then there's a between that and there's a margin between that and prime rate, and then of course your rate with your bank is probably prime plus something or maybe prime minus something, but tied to that as a benchmark. So reducing it down, but again, it was not a unanimous decision, and so this is kind of a new thing that's emerged on the Federal Reserve that in most years they are 12-0. This is what the votes go, 9-3 in this case. And there are some that think that the rates need to be reduced more, and then there are some that think they need to stay put. But most agreed and this 9-3 vote that it go down a quarter percent. So this is a not unexpected, but what it tells us is that their concerns about inflation have started to decline. I think over the last year or so, all the data pointed to like, hey, guys, you need to worry about the economy more than inflation. It was the question of where and when would tariffs settle, and how big an impact would that have, and would it cause um, supply chain problems that led to more sustained inflation? And I think that question has generally been no, that that it had an impact on prices, but it was a one-time impact. And now that it does seem like most of these rates have generally settled, still some disputes, still some negotiations happen in different countries. That does seem to kind of coincide with the Fed's being less concerned about inflation, more concerned about the jobs market, which, let's remember, the Federal Reserve's dual mandate: strong job market, keep inflation in check. They have to do both of those things. These are competing priorities, and sometimes the actions compete directly against each other. So in this case, it means that they're more concerned about the economy, and I think it's reasonable to say that the inflationary concerns have subsided somewhat. And if you look at their projections over the course of the next few years, you'll see that they don't really expect dramatic changes in unemployment, and they expect inflation actually to be a little bit less than today, although still higher than the benchmark 2%. I'll share with you during the data presentation exactly what they expect to happen in inflation over the course of the next 3 or 4 years.
All right, let's talk about a workers' comp case that the Michigan Supreme Court decided not to take up. Why is this noteworthy?
Yeah, so when the Supreme Court decides not to take something up, essentially what they're doing is they're affirming the decision of the appellate court. And in this case, it's the when it comes to immigration, legal versus illegal, or documented versus undocumented, or whatever terms that you prefer in that. Um, there's been this ongoing question of whether or not your legal status, if you are paying into the workers' comp system, should you be able to draw benefits. In Michigan, it's been a longstanding practice that if you're not legally employed, then you can't have claims out of the workers' comp. In fact, you can't participate in any way. You're not supposed to. And that had been challenged. And there was what kind of looked like maybe a landmark type of a case, or could have been set up for a landmark case, that was working its way through the process. But current law will stand because the Supreme Court decided not to take that case up.
All right, let's go into Election Watch 2026. A quick note, if you're watching this and you're near Northville, we do have one of our gubernatorial candidate series conversations tonight at 4:30 in Northville. You can get some details on our website. But let's switch gears and talk about the Democratic primary. We thought that maybe it was looking like a foregone conclusion, but Brian, you think that Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist still might have a foot in the door. Tell us what factors you're seeing.
Yeah, to be clear, I would still bet that the winner of that primary, of the Democratic primary for governor next year, would be Benson. She's in a very strong position, strong cash position, and polling is quite high. The Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist also running for the office, and has not posted strong fundraising numbers, but within the party there is there's different factions, just like the Republicans have factions, the Democrats have factions. And in the more liberal side of the party has people like Michigan's Rashida Tlaib, or Representative Omar from Minneapolis, or Bernie Sanders, the Senator Bernie Sanders. So that sort of wing of the party has not had success in kind of in gubernatorial elections generally. But Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist actually has been releasing endorsements from around the country, or from people from around the country that are part of that movement. And that movement definitely has been growing, gaining strength within the party. And so today he had announced Rep. Omar had endorsed his candidacy for governor from Minneapolis. So what that says to me is that that the competition within the party between the more, that, just to put some names on it so you kind of get the image of what I'm thinking, those are more kind of in the lane of Gretchen Whitmer versus those that are more in the lane of Bernie Sanders. So that's the competition. I still think that Benson is in a really strong position to win the Democratic primary, but the fact that there are national names from that competing wing of the party that are deciding to get involved in Michigan's election, I think is at least worth acknowledging that a foot must be in the door. There must be something that they're looking at that says that this isn't a foregone conclusion. And of course, nothing is until there's actually an election. That's why they still hold the elections, even with strong polling. So there is a there is the competition on the Republican side. I would say nothing dramatic has changed recently in that election. There are several people competing or vying for it. As we talked about polling last week, John James still in a very strong and commanding position. Mike Cox and Eric Nesbitt have done a fine job of raising money. And if you're paying attention to this stuff, you see Tom Leonard, who is we've got tonight in Northville that you'd mentioned as a and part of our candidate series. We're talking to all of these folks that aspire to be governor, one at a time. Has been traveling the state and actually has had a really say very highly engaged campaign, earned media campaign, where proposals and storylines to the campaign have been pretty consistent. So John James still definitely in a commanding lead, but again, the others have a foot in the door.
All right, Brian, it's time for Data Monday.
Gosh, it seems like it's been a long time since we've done a Data Monday, and that's because data was short during the federal shutdown. And so, what I want to do here is to start with the Federal Reserve's the Federal Reserve's projections. And what you'll see over here, let's just look at 2026. GDP, real GDP, so this means after inflation, 2.3%. So that's better than 2025. They expect it to be better than 2025. And then employment, about the same, but a little bit better next year than this year. Those two things alone send a message that that's not what they're most concerned about. The economy, they think I'm sorry, that they're when you look at that in conjunction with the inflation numbers that they expect are going down here, that they can take kind of modest steps toward normalization. So when I look at this, it says that they're not overly concerned about the economy or inflation. And that's not to say that there's nothing to be concerned about. It just means that that they're as they weigh these different factors, both look stable, and their projections for them are stable, which means that they can take steps toward normalization on interest rates. So here's what the federal funds rate looks like. 3.75, so it's come down to 3.75, and that's a good that's a good sign that they've got this steady decline. I've argued in the past that they're late in starting these reductions. I think they probably should be further along in the reductions, but while Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, seemed to go way out of his way to make sure that expectations were not set for additional rate cuts, or aggressive rate cuts, I should say, next year. They will do at least one. It is encouraging to see this moving along somewhat. The next one is average interest rate paid. This comes from the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses survey, and you'll see this kind of generally trending downward. Not an accident. That looks pretty similar to the federal funds rate. They're not perfectly tied together, but somewhat. And then the trade balance of goods and services. So remember when we talked about that part of the inflation calculation was that tariffs had kind of settled, and so we are seeing that the revenue coming into the federal government, if you look at that as kind of a proxy of whether things are settled, it does look pretty consistent. And then also the trade balance, you see, it does jump around a little bit, but within this band, but the trade deficit is getting smaller. So when this number goes up, remember, we're on the negative part of the graph. Look at the legend here. These are all negative numbers. So that means trade deficit. As that number goes up, the trade means the trade deficit is going down. So trade deficit, as you can see here, is trending in that direction. People argue all day long on whether or not that's good or bad. Obviously, the president prefers to reduce the trade deficits, even if it eliminates lower cost options. That's the trade-off. The and then looking at consumer imports. This one I thought I normally don't share this slide, but the reason I wanted to share it was that, of course, consumer impacts went down, or consumer imports went down after spiking up. Now, why'd they spike up? They were imports getting ahead of the tariffs. So like essentially trying to buy and store, stockpile, if you will, and then imports fell quite a bit, but actually bounced back a little bit. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then the final one here is, or actually maybe I've got a few more slides. We'll make this the last one though. The NFIB survey on the most important problem, and in this case, the last a couple of surveys, the most important problem. There's a new leader, and that's quality of labor. So we hadn't really seen that since right before the pandemic. Of course, inflation kind of took over in most of those months since then. But you'll see that while inflation is still a significant factor, that those concerns have come down, quality of labor has come up. That is interesting. The fact that quality of labor is taken over as the number one in that national survey among small business owners, it I wouldn't be surprised if that was tied to the increasing cost of compensation. And so compensation and benefits and employment mandates, all the different things that drive up cost of employment, means that you really do need to get a lot of productivity out of every single worker in order to just make the math work. And so I wonder if those rising costs are leading to a point where small business owners must get more productivity, and therefore quality of labor has to go up in order to justify the overall cost. So kind of a complicated picture, but overall, it looks fairly stable to me, even if on the weaker side.
All right, well, thanks for that report, Brian. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, this is our final episode for 2025. You can find us online for the next couple of weeks and on social media, but we'll be back here on January 5th. Happy holidays, happy new year, and we'll see you in 2026.
See you next time.